a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Russia. Russia, officially the Russian Federation, is a country in Eurasia. At 17,125,200 square kilometers, Russia is the largest country in the world by area, covering more than 1/8 of the Earth's inhabited land area, and the 9th most populous, with over 144 million people, excluding Crimea. About 77% of the population live in the Western, European part of the country. Russia's capital, Moscow, is the largest metropolitan area in Europe proper and one of the largest cities in the world. Other major cities include Saint Petersburg, Novosibirsk, Yekaterinburg, and Nizhny Novgorod. Extending across the entirety of Northern Asia and much of Eastern Europe, Russia spans 11 time zones and incorporates a wide range of environments and landforms. From northwest to southeast, Russia shares land borders with Norway, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, China, Mongolia, and North Korea. It shares maritime borders with Japan by the Sea of Okh and the U.S. state of Alaska across the Bering Strait. The East Slavs emerged as a recognizable group in Europe between the 3rd and 8th centuries AD, founded and ruled by a Varangian warrior elite and their descendants. The medieval state of Rus arose in the 9th century. In 988 it adopted Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire, beginning the synthesis of Byzantine and Slavic cultures that defined Russian culture for the next millennium. Rus ultimately disintegrated into a number of smaller states. Most of the Rus lands were overrun by the Mongol invasion and became tributaries of the nomadic Golden Horde in the 13th century. The Grand Duchy of Moscow gradually reunified the surrounding Russian principalities, achieved independence from the Golden Horde. By the 18th century, the nation had greatly expanded through conquest, annexation, and exploration to become the Russian Empire, which was the third largest empire in history, stretching from Poland on the west to Alaska on the east. Following the Russian Revolution, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic became the largest and leading constituent of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the world's first constitutionally socialist state. The Soviet Union played a decisive role in the Allied victory in World War II, and emerged as a recognized superpower and rival to the United States during the Cold War. The Soviet era saw some of the most significant technological achievements of the 20th century, including the world's first human-made satellite and the launching of the first humans in space. By the end of 1990, the Soviet Union had the world's second-largest economy, largest standing military in the world and the largest stockpile of weapons of mass destruction. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, 12 independent republics emerged from the USSR: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and the Baltic states regained independence: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The Russian SFSR reconstituted itself as the Russian Federation and is recognized as the continuing legal personality and a successor of the Soviet Union. It is governed as a federal semi-presidential republic. Russia's economy ranks as the 12th largest by nominal GDP and 6th largest by purchasing power parity in 2015. Russia's extensive mineral and energy resources are the largest such reserves in the world, making it one of the leading producers of oil and natural gas globally. The country is one of the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states and possesses the largest stockpile of weapons of mass destruction. Russia is a great power as well as a regional power, and has been characterized as a potential superpower. It is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and an active global partner of ASEAN, as well as a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the G20, the Council of Europe, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the World Trade Organization, as well as being the leading member of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and one of the 5 members of the Eurasian Economic Union, along with Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Etymology. The name Russia is derived from Rus, a medieval state populated mostly by the East Slavs. However, this proper name became more prominent in the later history, and the country typically was called by its inhabitants, which can be translated as Russian land or Land of Rus. In order to distinguish this state from other states derived from it, it is denoted as Kievan Rus by modern historiography. The name Rus itself comes from the early medieval Rus people, Swedish merchants and warriors who relocated from across the Baltic Sea and founded a state centered on Novgorod that later became Kievan Rus. An Old Latin version of the name Rus was Ruthenia, mostly applied to the western and southern regions of Rus that were adjacent to Catholic Europe. The current name of the country comes from the Byzantine Greek designation of the Rus, Rho Omega Sigma Sigma Alpha Russia, spelled Rho Omega Sigma Alpha in modern Greek. The standard way to refer to citizens of Russia is Russians in English and Russian in Russian. There are two Russian words which are commonly translated into English as Russians. One is, which most often means ethnic Russians. Another is, which means citizens of Russia, regardless of ethnicity. Translations into other languages often do not distinguish these two groups. Early history. Nomadic pastoralism developed in the Pontic Caspian steppe beginning in the Chalcolithic. In classical antiquity, the Pontic steppe was known as Scythia. Beginning in the 8th century BC, ancient Greek traders brought their civilization to the trade emporiums into nascent Phanagoria. Ancient Greek explorers, most notably Pythias, even went as far as modern-day Kaliningrad, on the Baltic Sea. Romans settled on the western part of the Caspian Sea, where their empire stretched towards the east. In the 3rd to 4th centuries AD, a semi-legendary Gothic kingdom of Oyam existed in southern Russia until it was overrun by Huns. Between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD, the Bosporan kingdom, a Hellenistic polity which succeeded the Greek colonies, was also overwhelmed by nomadic invasions led by warlike tribes, such as the Huns and Eurasian Avars. A Turkic people, the Khazars, ruled the lower Volga basin steppes between the Caspian and Black Seas until the 10th century. The ancestors of modern Russians are the Slavic tribes, whose original home is thought by some scholars to have been the wooded areas of the Pinsk marshes. The East Slavs gradually settled western Russia in two waves, one moving from Kiev toward present-day Suzdal and Murom, and another from Polotsk toward Novgorod and Rostov. From the 7th century onwards, the East Slavs constituted the bulk of the population in western Russia and assimilated the native Finno-Ugric peoples, including the Moya, the Muromians, and the Meshchera. Kievan Rus. The establishment of the first East Slavic states in the 9th century coincided with the arrival of Varangians, the traders, warriors and settlers from the Baltic Sea region. Primarily they were Vikings of Scandinavian origin, who ventured along the waterways extending from the eastern Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas. According to the primary chronicle, a Varangian from Rus people, named Rurik, was elected ruler of Novgorod in 862. In 882, his successor Oleg ventured south and conquered Kiev, which had been previously paying tribute to the Khazars, founding Kievan Rus. Oleg, Rurik's son Igor, and Igor's son Sviatoslav subsequently subdued all local East Slavic tribes to Kievan rule, destroyed the Kazakh Khaganate and launched several military expeditions to Byzantium and Persia. In the 10th to 11th centuries, Kievan Rus became one of the largest and most prosperous states in Europe. The reigns of Vladimir the Great and his son Yaroslav the Wise constitute the Golden Age of Kiev, which saw the acceptance of Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium and the creation of the first East Slavic written legal code, the Russkaya Pravda. In the 11th and 12th centuries, constant incursions by nomadic Turkic tribes, such as the Kipchaks and the Pechenegs, caused a massive migration of Slavic populations to the safer, heavily forested regions of the north, particularly to the area known as Zalesye. The age of feudalism and decentralization was marked by constant infighting between members of the Rurik dynasty that ruled Kievan Rus collectively. Kiev's dominance waned, to the benefit of Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, Novgorod Republic in the northwest and Galicia-Volhynia in the southwest. Ultimately Kievan Rus disintegrated, with the final blow being the Mongol invasion of 1237–40 that resulted in the destruction of Kiev and the death of about half the population of Rus. The invading Mongol elite, together with their conquered Turkic subjects, became known as Tatars, forming the state of the Golden Horde, which pillaged the Russian principalities. The Mongols ruled the Cuman-Kipchak Confederation and Volga Bulgaria for over 2 centuries. Galicia-Volhynia was eventually assimilated by the Kingdom of Poland, while the Mongol-dominated Vladimir Suzdal and Novgorod Republic, 2 regions on the periphery of Kiev, established the basis for the modern Russian nation. The Novgorod together with Pskov retained some degree of autonomy during the time of the Mongol yoke, and were largely spared the atrocities that affected the rest of the country. Led by Prince Alexander Nevsky, Novgorodians repelled the invading Swedes in the Battle of the Neva in 1240, as well as the Germanic Crusaders in the Battle of the Ice in 1242, breaking their attempts to colonize the northern Rus. Grand Duchy of Moscow. The most powerful state to eventually arise after the destruction of Kievan Rus was the Grand Duchy of Moscow, initially a part of Vladimir Suzdal. While still under the domain of the Mongol Tatars, and with their connivance, Moscow began to assert its influence in the central Rus in the early 14th century, gradually becoming the leading force in the process of the Rus lands' reunification and expansion of Russia. Moscow's last rival, the Novgorod Republic, prospered as the chief fur trade center and the easternmost port of the Hanseatic League. Times remained difficult, with frequent Mongol-Tatar raids. Agriculture suffered from the beginning of the Little Ice Age. As in the rest of Europe, plague was a frequent occurrence between 1350 and 1490. However, because of the lower population density and better hygiene, widespread practicing of banya, a wet steam bath, the death rate from plague was not as severe as in Western Europe, and population numbers recovered by 1,500. Led by Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow, and helped by the Russian Orthodox Church, the United Army of Russian Principalities inflicted a milestone defeat on the Mongol Tatars in the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. Moscow gradually absorbed the surrounding principalities, including formerly strong rivals such as Tver and Novgorod. Ivan III finally threw off the control of the Golden Horde and consolidated the whole of Central and Northern Rus under Moscow's dominion. He was also the first to take the title, Grand Duke of all the Russias. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Moscow claimed succession to the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire. Ivan III married Sophia Palaiologina, the niece of the last Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, and made the Byzantine double-headed eagle his own, and eventually Russia's, coat of arms. Tsardom of Russia. In development of the Third Rome ideas, the Grand Duke Ivan IV was officially crowned first Tsar of Russia in 1547. The Tsar promulgated a new code of laws, established the first Russian feudal representative body, and introduced local self-management into the rural regions. During his long reign, Ivan the Terrible nearly doubled the already large Russian territory by annexing the 3 Tatar Khanates, Kazan and Astrakhan along the Volga River, and the Siberian Khanate in southwestern Siberia. Thus, by the end of the 16th century Russia was transformed into a multi-ethnic, multi-denominational and transcontinental state. However, the Tsardom was weakened by the long and unsuccessful Livonian War against the coalition of Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden for access to the Baltic coast and sea trade. At the same time, the Tatars of the Crimean Khanate, the only remaining successor to the Golden Horde, continued to raid southern Russia. In an effort to restore the Volga Khanates, Crimeans and their Ottoman allies invaded central Russia, and were even able to burn down parts of Moscow in 1571. But in the next year the large invading army was thoroughly defeated by Russians in the Battle of Melody, forever eliminating the threat of an Ottoman Crimean expansion into Russia. The slave raids of Crimeans, however, did not cease until the late 17th century, though the construction of new fortification lines across southern Russia, such as the Great Abaty Line, constantly narrowed the area accessible to incursions. The death of Ivan's sons marked the end of the ancient Rurik dynasty in 1598, and in combination with the famine of 1603 led to civil war, the rule of pretenders, and foreign intervention during the time of troubles in the early 17th century. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth occupied parts of Russia, including Moscow. In 1612, the Poles were forced to retreat by the Russian Volunteer Corps, led by two national heroes, merchant Kuzma Minin and Prince Dmitry Poshersky. The Romanov dynasty acceded to the throne in 1613 by the decision of Zemsky Soba, and the country started its gradual recovery from the crisis. Russia continued its territorial growth through the 17th century, which was the age of Cossacks. Cossacks were warriors organized into military communities, resembling pirates and pioneers of the New World. In 1648, the peasants of Ukraine joined the Zaporozhian Cossacks in rebellion against Poland-Lithuania during the Khmelnytsky uprising in reaction to the social and religious oppression they had been suffering under Polish rule. In 1654, the Ukrainian leader, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, offered to place Ukraine under the protection of the Russian Tsar. Alexei Alexei's acceptance of this offer led to another Russo-Polish war. Finally, Ukraine was split along the Dnieper River, leaving the western part, right bank Ukraine, under Polish rule and the eastern part under Russian rule. Later, in 1670-71, the Don Cossacks led by Stenka Razin initiated a major uprising in the Volga region, but the Tsar's troops were successful in defeating the rebels. In the east, the rapid Russian exploration and colonization of the huge territories of Siberia was led mostly by Cossacks hunting for valuable furs and ivory. Russian explorers pushed eastward primarily along the Siberian river routes, and by the mid-17th century there were Russian settlements in eastern Siberia, on the Chukchi Peninsula, along the Amur River, and on the Pacific coast. In 1648, the Bering Strait between Asia and North America was passed for the first time by Fyodor Popov and Semyon Deshnyov. Imperial Russia. Under Peter the Great, Russia was proclaimed an empire in 1721 and became recognized as a world power. Ruling from 1682 to 1725, Peter defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, forcing it to cede West Karelia and Ingria, as well as Estland and Livland, securing Russia's access to the sea and sea trade. On the Baltic Sea, Peter founded a new capital called Saint Petersburg, later known as Russia's window to Europe. Peter the Great's reforms brought considerable Western European cultural influences to Russia. The reign of Peter's daughter Elizabeth in 1741-62 saw Russia's participation in the 7 Years' War. During this conflict, Russia annexed East Prussia for a while and even took Berlin. However, upon Elizabeth's death, all these conquests were returned to the Kingdom of Prussia by pro-Prussian Peter III of Russia. Catherine II, who ruled in 1762-96, presided over the age of Russian Enlightenment. She extended Russian political control over the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and incorporated most of its territories into Russia during the partitions of Poland, pushing the Russian frontier westward into Central Europe. In the south, after successful Russo-Turkish wars against Ottoman Turkey, Catherine advanced Russia's boundary to the Black Sea, defeating the Crimean Khanate. As a result of victories over Qajar Iran through the Russo-Persian Wars, by the first half of the 19th century Russia also made significant territorial gains in Transcaucasia and the North Caucasus, forcing the former to irrevocably cede what is nowadays Georgia, Dagestan, Azerbaijan, and Armenia to Russia. This continued with Alexander's wresting of Finland from the weakened Kingdom of Sweden in 1809 and of Bessarabia from the Ottomans in 1812. At the same time, Russians colonized Alaska and even founded settlements in California, such as Fort Ross. In 1803-1806, the first Russian circumnavigation was made, later followed by other notable Russian sea exploration voyages. In 1820, a Russian expedition discovered the continent of Antarctica. In alliances with various European countries, Russia fought against Napoleon's France. The French invasion of Russia at the height of Napoleon's power in 1812 reached Moscow. but eventually failed miserably as the obstinate resistance in combination with the bitterly cold Russian winter led to a disastrous defeat of invaders, in which more than 95% of the pan-European Grand Army perished. Led by Mikhail Kutuzov and Barclay de Tolly, the Russian army ousted Napoleon from the country and drove through Europe in the War of the Sixth Coalition, finally entering Paris. Alexander I headed Russia's delegation at the Congress of Vienna that defined the map of post-Napoleonic Europe. The officers of the Napoleonic Wars brought ideas of liberalism back to Russia with them, and attempted to curtail the Tsar's powers during the aborted Decembrist revolt of 1825. At the end of the conservative reign of Nicholas I, a zenith period of Russia's power and influence in Europe was disrupted by defeat in the Crimean War. Between 1847 and 1851, about 1 million people died of Asiatic cholera. Nicholas' successor Alexander II enacted significant changes in the country, including the Emancipation Reform of 1861. These great reforms spurred industrialization and modernized the Russian army, which had successfully liberated Bulgaria from Ottoman rule in the 1877-78 Russo-Turkish War. The late 19th century saw the rise of various socialist movements in Russia. Alexander II was killed in 1881 by revolutionary terrorists, and the reign of his son Alexander III was less liberal, but more peaceful. The last Russian emperor, Nicholas II, was unable to prevent the events of the Russian Revolution of 1905, triggered by the unsuccessful Russo-Japanese War and the demonstration incident known as Bloody Sunday. The uprising was put down, but the government was forced to concede major reforms, including granting the freedoms of speech and assembly, the legalization of political parties, and the creation of an elected legislative body, the State Duma of the Russian Empire. The Stolypin agrarian reform led to a massive peasant migration and settlement into Siberia. More than 4 million settlers arrived in that region between 1906 and 1914. Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. Would you like to know more?